International relations. So in our video today, we're going to be talking about power. Power is the most important function when we're talking about international relations because there are a lot of different perceptions of power. There are a lot of different perceptions of what makes a state powerful. Is it the resources you control? Is it the military that you have? Is it the amount of wealth that you have? Is it your geographic location? And there's also a lot of interest when we're talking about how states can manipulate others. What factors will cause a state to do something they won't necessarily do? These are all questions that revolve around the issue and the idea of power in international relations. And we're going to be talking about that today. I'm excited. I hope you're excited. Let's get started. Now, the oldest perception of international relations, the oldest way that scholars have viewed how states interact is based on realism. And realism is really based on the idea of dominance, that states interact completely around the idea of power and who has power and how do I get more power and how can I use my power to get even more powerful or to lord my power over other states. It's an idea that there's this invisible hierarchy of states and that to get higher and higher you need to get more power depending on that's power through resources, wealth, or military might. Now, realism is actually so old that we didn't have a name for it. The reason why we call realism realism is because there was another perception called idealism that came about after World War II. And so because idealism comes about, we had to give a name to the normal perception that we had. Now, idealism is the idea that human nature is essentially good instead of evil, that states should cooperate and work together to solve issues, and that the international system is a community, that we all basically need to cooperate to become successful. Realism says, no, we're not a community, it's a competition. And the way that we can become successful is to try to dominate one another, not work together. Now, realists have blamed idealists for looking too much at how the world ought to be instead of how it actually is. One of the most famous idealists in world history was actually Woodrow Wilson, who comes up with the idea for the League of Nations and his 14 points. If you don't know anything about Woodrow Wilson, he is the President of the United States after World War I. Now, the big question when it comes to power in international relations is how do you define what power is and how do you gauge power? How much do resources or wealth or particular geographic locations or military power, how much does that matter in how powerful a country is? And that's very difficult to measure. If we're talking about the definition of power, there's a theoretical definition and an empirical definition. The theoretical definition of power is for one state to compel another state to do something they wouldn't normally do. Now, how does one state do that? Well, they could threaten them with their military, they could threaten them with wealth, they could entice them with alliances, they could entice them with funding, but basically power is getting one state to do something they wouldn't normally do. The empirical definition, there are material elements and non-material elements that influence how much power a state has. For instance, material elements, things that you can actually touch and see, would be the gross domestic product of a country, their size, how much income they have, the size of their military. It's all numbers, material elements, things that you can look at on a stat sheet. Non-material elements are things that can't be measured, like the diplomatic skill of leaders of that state, the will of the people in being unified toward a particular goal, support for the government. These are not numbers that you can look at on a stat sheet. But a combination of those material and non-material elements will define what power is. Now, it's very difficult to actually estimate power. Realism basically says, if you're looking at a conflict and wars, the most powerful state is going to win. But the problem is how you define what power is. Is power the size of a military? Is power the will of a state to win in a war? Is it support from the people? Is it the amount of money? And the one thing we've really found is that the most important indicator of power in a war is your gross domestic product, because with your gross domestic product and your wealth, you can buy a large army, you can buy propaganda to get support from your people, you can buy allies. If you're talking about a conflict, we're finding it's GDP. However, power in an international relations setting outside of war and conflict is hard to measure because it's a mix of a lot of different things. Now, there are tangible and intangible elements of power, and not only tangible and intangible elements, but also long-term and short-term elements. So if we're looking at long-term elements that are tangible, things we can see on a stat sheet, that would be your GDP, the size of your population, how big your territory is, and what natural resources that you have. Those are things that are long-term, things that will stick around in a state. Less tangible elements that are in long-term would be your political culture, how people view politics and their role in there, their patriotism and their nationalism, what their education level is, what technology that state has. These are all things that states have long-term. However, there are short-term elements of power that are tangible, that you can touch and see, and non-tangible. Short-term tangible elements are the idea of producing weapons, because you don't have a large stockpile of weapons all the time as a state. If you're in a conflict or in a war, you can rev that up. So that's a short-term element of power. Also the size of your army. A lot of times states will have a standard size for the military, but if they're in a war or conflict, they will increase that with a draft. Less tangible elements would be the support and legitimacy of the people. Because if you're looking at power, if the people don't see your government as legitimate, that will hurt how much power and influence you have. Also, international support. If you are doing something, international support actually wanes because of an action that you've taken. These are all short-term elements, things that can change dramatically and within a very short amount of time. Now, realists will say that if we're looking at power, and what a measurement of power is, they're going to say it's the size of your military force. And again, this is not in wartime. In wartime, it's your GDP. Outside of wartime, in peacetime, it's your military. If you want to compel other states to do things they wouldn't normally do, or listen to you, or take you seriously, it's the size of your military. Because if you can put a large military into the field, then you could threaten that other country's sovereignty or legitimacy, and they're going to try and do things so that you don't do that. Well, that is our look at power. We're going to continue talking about power politics in our next 2 videos as well, and I hope you learned something you did not know before. Thanks for watching.